being with us. Excellent. Okay, so hello everyone. Those of you who are joining us at today's webinar, ACM Open, Navigating the Open Access Publication Model. Thank you for joining us. I'm very glad you could all make it. I'm Mona Castro, the chair of ACM SIGGRAPH, and I'm very thrilled to announce and introduce our wonderful speakers for this very important decision. ACM Director of Publications, Scott Delman, and ACM Senior Member and Publications Advisors to SGB, Jonathan Aldrich. Many of you are aware that ACM is in the process of transitioning to an open access publication model. And this webinar is an opportunity to learn about the progress of the transition and also gain a better understanding of what ACM Open means for those of you who publish with ACM, and especially those of you who contribute to our SIGGRAPH organization, sponsored or co-sponsored conferences throughout the year. We anticipate that this transition to open access will obviously bring a lot of benefits and also some implications for SIGGRAPH and the conferences and the communities. So it's a major change, and we want to make sure that our volunteers and members, contributors are well informed and prepared. Before I start, I want to thank Scott and Jonathan for generously giving their time. When I reached out to them about the session, they did not hesitate and both enthusiastically accepted the invitation. And I also want to thank you, our audience, for being here at ACM SIGGRAPH. We really value your inputs and want to provide you with the information and the support you need. So please don't hesitate to share any thoughts, any suggestions with us, especially directly to me. And a reminder, we have 2024 ACM SIGGRAPH election underway right now, so I encourage all the active members to please cast your votes by August 12th. Your voice is very essential in shaping the future of our organization, and your participation in this election process just helps that we continue to represent the needs and interests of our many communities. All right, let's get started. I'll hand this to Scott and Jonathan. We have dedicated about 15-20 minutes for Q&A, but that can also be longer. We'll see. So please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A section, and I'll do my best to consolidate and facilitate that with our wonderful speakers. So let's begin. Jonathan and Scott, thank you again.
Thank you. First, let me once again, I want to thank Mona and the rest of the SIGGRAPH leadership for inviting us to give this talk and to have a dialogue with you about this transition to open access. Let me first hand it to Jonathan to see if he has any intro remarks, and then what we're planning to do is walk everyone through a presentation on ACM Open to give some background, to give some of the details about what the model is, and then to give you a sense of sort of our progress through the last 4 years and what we are projecting over the next year and a half leading up to January 1st, 2026, which is when ACM has announced that it intends to flip to a full 100% open access publisher. And then, as Mona said, we certainly want to leave plenty of time at the end to answer questions. I know what some of those questions are going to be because we've given this talk to a few of the different ACM special interest groups, and some of the sort of the most sort of interesting and urgent questions from the SIGs have been around APCs, authors, making sure that there's equity in the system, waivers for those individuals who can't afford APCs where there will be APCs. Those kinds of questions. We'll certainly address that in the presentation itself. If you have questions about any particular slide, please put them in the Q&A, and Mona is going to be reading through that and decide if it's something that we should sort of take a pause during the presentation and address the question and hopefully give you an answer before moving on throughout the presentation. So first, let me check in with Jonathan and see if there's other things that you want to say.
Sure. Well, I'd like thank you, Scott, and thank you, Mona, very much for inviting us. It's great to be here. Open access is something I care passionately about myself as an ACM member. I think it's super important to find every way we can to get out the research literature. So I'm excited about the upcoming transition. But it's also the case that, you know, change is hard, and we all have to adjust. You know, I think as both a member of the publications board and the SIG governing board, a lot of people at ACM and ACM leadership as well have been working super hard to make this transition a success. So I'm excited about what it means for science and in computer science, and I'll pass it back to Scott, who has the latest details on the transition.
Thank you. Scott, before you start, we have a quick question about the acronym APC. What is APC?
Absolutely. It is article processing charge. So this is typically in the world of open access, and this is something that almost all other scholarly publishers are using as the basis for their open access models. So instead of institutions paying publishers to access content on publisher websites like the ACM Digital Library or IEEE Explore, the model shifts to charging APCs, where readers or funders or institutions will pay those APCs at the time the author is accepted into the publication, and then the publication itself is free to read for the rest of the world. So essentially what that means is when ACM flips to a completely open access future, the DL will be open. So anyone will be free to read any article and see any piece of content and use that content in the digital library. APCs are a really sort of political and heated topic, because one of the things that we learned very early on is that the computer science community does not like APCs. And so when we developed the ACM Open model, day one, we started working on this in 2018, one of the goals was to avoid APCs entirely. And so everything I'm going to talk through during this presentation is aimed at what we call ACM Open, which is a non-APC model. It is aimed at essentially having institutions support the publication activity by signing institutional licenses with ACM instead of asking authors to pay APCs. So we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail in just a few minutes. So let me just ask Mona and Jonathan if you can see, hopefully, the first slide of the presentation, and then I'll take it from there.
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Okay, so important to take a sort of look at the very beginning of all of this. ACM has been working on open access for about 11 years. We started, well, maybe even longer than that. There have been lots of initiatives over the years within the digital library, even some technical tools that we offered authors, called Authorizer was one example of that enabled authors to actually make their content freely available. But it really started in 2013 when ACM took a decision to offer what we were calling at the time hybrid open access. And essentially what hybrid open access meant was that all of our content was sitting behind the digital library paywall that only was accessible by either individuals paying to subscribe to the digital library or institutions around the world. These could be universities, they could be companies, they could be government research institutes, paying for access to everything in the digital library. And the hybrid came in where we offered the ability for an author to pay an APC for a conference article, for a journal article, for a magazine article. And by paying that APC, the authors were effectively making sure that ACM would put that article in front of that digital library paywall so that anybody in the world from any country would be able to access that article, download it, and use it. So we started that in 2013. I think we launched it actually in April of 2013. And within the first few years of that, we saw that grow a bit, up to about 4 or 5% of the articles that we published at the time. And at that time, it was 20 to 23,000 articles a year that we were publishing. So about 5% of those at kind of the height were being published on an open access basis as a result of authors taking the decision to pay an APC, which was typically funded by a research grant. So most of the large funders around the world, in the United States, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, Australia, Japan, and sort of the list goes on, are able to use a small piece of their research grants to cover open access processing charges, or APCs. And so we saw that grow to about 5%, but then we saw it level off. And in the years that followed, it really remained around 5%. And after a few years of that, we decided, we have to try something different, because getting to 5% really was not the goal for ACM. We very much wanted to get as close to 100% as we possibly could. So we started working in 2018 with a group of universities, and I'll name those universities here. It's not confidential. It was Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of California System, the Iowa State University, the University of Minnesota, and Carnegie Mellon University. And we were working also with many international universities in the UK and Europe to get feedback to inform the model. And we decided that we were going to try to develop a completely new model that didn't rely on the payment of APCs by authors, but rather tapped into the institution's funds, both university library funds as well as research grants that those universities were holding on behalf of their researchers and utilizing. And so we spent a couple of years developing a model in close coordination with those institutions. And in January of 2020, we launched the ACM Open model. About 6 months later, actually this happened in early 2020, around the same time, there was a movement within the ACM community to accelerate this transition to open access. And so a group of individuals, and I think Jonathan is probably familiar with the history of that, signed a petition on a change.org petition to push ACM to accelerate that transition. And ultimately, this led to an ACM Council resolution. The ACM Council is ACM's board of directors. These are all members of the community that are elected by the membership of ACM and appointed by the SIGs, by the SGB, by the publications board, and other members of that council, to essentially vote to set a timeline for transitioning to a full open access publisher. And what was agreed, that resolution passed unanimously and set about a 5-year time to transition. We're now about 4 years into that, a little less than 4 years into that. And we are still very much on target for the January 1st, 2026 deadline, after which everything that ACM publishes will become open access. If you look at the bottom of this slide, and I'm not going to go into too much more detail, there were a lot of drivers for this. It was, of course, the petition was one of those things that was the impetus for the council resolution. But for many years that we were moving in this direction. Government mandates in the US, in the UK, throughout Europe, and elsewhere around the world were really pushing scholarly publishers to be offering more and more open access options for their authors. Library community globally was pushing for this, have been pushing for this for 20 years. And most importantly, as we started collecting data, as we started publishing open access articles in 2013, we started realizing that when an article is published on an open access basis, and this is somewhat intuitive, but we wanted the data to confirm this, of course, we analyzed the data, and it showed very clearly that when articles are in fact published in our various journals and conferences in front of the paywall, day one on an open access basis, those articles are being downloaded 2 to 3 times as much as articles that are sitting behind the digital library paywall. Important to keep in mind that there are about 2,600 institutions around the world that subscribe to the ACM Digital Library and have for over 20 years. And so anyone that's affiliated with any of those universities have always had access to everything in the DL. So there were always millions of individuals that had access to everything that we publish. But even there, when we opened up that paywall for those articles, we saw a pretty significant increase in usage. and also citations. So we use a non-ACM database called Dimensions to analyze citations of ACM published articles that are in front of the paywall and behind the paywall. And we found that articles published from day one in front of the paywall on an open access basis are getting cited about 70% more than articles that are sitting behind the paywall. And we're comparing apples to apples. So we're looking in SIGGRAPH, articles that are published behind the paywall, the DL paywall in SIGGRAPH, versus articles where the authors paid an APC and the article is OA. So the data was really clear, and it's moving in this direction every year when we look at the data. We've analyzed it over about a 10-year period of time, and it's pretty clear that open access content is accelerating science. It makes sense to be moving in this direction. So this just confirms what we already knew, and that and the other drivers really pushed us in this direction. So we developed this model. We launched it in January of 2020. The model is first and foremost an institutional model, which means that we're not asking the individual author to pay for ACM Open. We're asking institutions to pay. And the costs typically are coming from a combination of library budgets, computer science budgets, Office of Research budgets, and maybe elsewhere within the university where there are funds. Sometimes there are open access funds. Basic ideas, instead of charging an APC, which is a set price for every single article that we publish, you set an annual price and you set a fixed price for an institution so that they pay one price, and that covers all of the access and all of the publication needs for all of the authored papers affiliated with that institution. Unlimited read and an unlimited publish is sort of what we call this model. We developed a tier-based model. So we look at the 2,600 or so digital library subscribing institutions, and we divided them into what were 10 tiers based on publication history. So we looked at the top publishing institutions in the world, the ones that are publishing the most articles in ACM's journals, magazines, and conferences. Those are called tier 1 institutions in this model. And then we have on the other end, tier 10 institutions where they are primarily reading content. They're downloading articles in the digital library and using the DL, but they're not really authoring articles. So they don't publish very much at all. And then pricing was assigned to each of those tiers based on the level of publishing activity. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And then a few years after we launched the model, we started to realize, and in talking to institutions, quite literally thousands of institutions, that we needed to create another add-on model to that tier-based model, which is called the all-in model. And essentially, that's for library consortia, which is how the digital library has typically been sold, that are funded by governments. And so in Europe, and in certain places in Asia and in Latin and South America, a government might buy on behalf of all of the universities access to a publisher's content. And a government might buy what we would call a read and publish agreement, an open access agreement, on behalf of all of the participating members of that consortium. And so we developed that model to make it possible for more and more institutions to join. One of the results of the pricing model and the way that we created the tiering was that those institutions that don't publish very much are paying the least amount, and those institutions that are publishing a lot are paying the most. And so ultimately, when you look at the distribution of those roughly 2,600 institutions, the top 1/3 are being asked to pay more, and in some instances, a lot more. So if I look at the very top of the spectrum, I'm going to use this example because it's Jonathan's institution. Carnegie Mellon is a top tier 1 institution. It's one of the 5 largest for ACM, and we call it a tier 1. And they're asked to pay $95,000 a year, which they do. Before the ACM Open model, they were paying less than $10,000 a year. So they were asked to take a pretty significant increase in cost. The flip side of that is when you look at how many articles they're actually publishing, and you divide that into the amount of money that they're being charged for the license, it's actually a pretty significant bargain for those institutions. And many of those tier one institutions look at it and say, this is actually very affordable for them. Not all of them, and that's actually the challenge. Generally speaking, about 1/3 of those customers are paying a lot more, and 2/3 of those customers are paying a lot less. And so we reduce pricing for the bottom, those institutions that don't publish very much, and we were increasing pricing for those that publish a lot. These are multi-year agreements. Because we're asking a significant number of those institutions to pay more, ACM committed to being extremely transparent with what we're doing with that money. And so we started publishing, and I'll show you in a minute, a couple of examples of that. We started publishing articles in the communications of the ACM that go into a decent amount of detail on the model itself and what it costs to run ACM's publishing program. And so we've now published 4 of those articles. We're going to come out with the 5th article very soon. And that shows exactly what ACM spends on its journal publishing program, on its conference publishing program, on the digital library itself, on production, on staff, on all of the elements that go into running ACM publications. And we are committed to being transparent with that. We also wanted to make sure that behind the scenes, there were aspects of the model that made sure that every author that participates in ACM Open will be compliant with the government mandates that exist around the world for open access. And several of those mandates, including for US authors that are working with research grants funded by the federal government, many of those open access mandates are out there. Authors have to comply, research recipients have to comply with those mandates. And in particular, the US OSTP mandates are going into effect officially, where there will be enforcement from the federal government at the end of 2025, which just so happens to align very well with when ACM flips to a 100% publisher, open access publisher. Same is true in Europe. The same is true in the United Kingdom. The same is true in other countries around the world. So we wanted to make sure that when we become a fully open access publisher and you're an ACM author and you're submitting your paper to ACM, that the one thing you don't have to worry about is compliance with your funder. And so generally speaking, many of these funders have the same requirements for open access: data management plans, copyright retention, the ability to use Creative Commons licensing, and there's a longer list of those kinds of requirements. And ACM Open takes care of all of that. And then, of course, there are going to be individuals that are either not affiliated with institutions or are affiliated with institutions in countries where it's just not economically feasible for them to pay ACM. And so we wanted to put into place a very generous, I think, and liberal financial waivers program, which we've already rolled out, and I'll explain a little bit about that later on, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. Very quickly, I won't get caught up on the numbers here. This is what that looks like. This is the tier model. We don't ask an institution that joins to pay that full number in the first year. We actually have a ramp-up schedule, so they'll have time to actually figure out budgeting requirements for it. But those are the numbers, transparent. It's on our website. Everyone can see it. And the basic idea is that if you're a tier one institution in the United States, and you're a tier one institution in the UK, or you're a tier one institution in China, your institution's being asked to pay exactly the same amount of money. Certain countries are getting waivers and big discounts, but generally speaking, the top tier 1 through 5 institutions are publishing a lot and have the same financial requirements. One of the things that was really clear when we were developing the model was that there was a really significant imbalance between where the content was coming from, so where the papers were being submitted from and published from, and where ACM's digital library income was coming from. And so this table, we took a bunch of different categories. So we looked at the top 100 institutions by publication, so the number of articles being published out of those institutions, and we took different groupings here. And one of the things that we noticed immediately was the imbalance. The top 100, for example, represents about a third of the articles that we publish every year, and that's still generally the case. This year, actually in 2023, we published about 29,000 articles, what we call research eligible articles. And yet that same group, when we started this model back in 2019, 2020, only represented about 5% of the digital library income. And if you look at the other lines in this table, you'll see, the top 250 represents over half of the articles, but only 10%, 11% of the income. And this was an imbalance. And what this meant was this very long tail of about 1,500 or 1,600 institutions at the bottom that don't publish very much at all, less than 15% of what ACM publishes every year. We're responsible for about 70% of the income coming from digital library licenses every year. That's fine with a subscription model, but if you're going to flip to mandatory open access, there's a very significant likelihood that those bottom 1,600 institutions, what we call tier 10 institutions, are going to cancel. And if that happened without taking any kind of action, then ACM would lose 70% of the publishing income that we have, and ACM would no longer be able to be a scientific publisher. We assume that most of the community doesn't want that to happen. ACM is a good actor and is considered one of the leading publishers in the space. And so when people ask us, why are we asking big institutions to pay so much money? This is really one of the main reasons, is that we had to rebalance, because effectively this long tail of institutions that don't use the digital library very much and don't publish really very much at all were really providing the vast majority of the income. And so they were essentially subsidizing the Carnegie Mellons of the world, which are getting most of the benefit from the digital library. So we really wanted to rebalance that. This was the goal at the time. We wanted some level of fairness and equity. And so we wanted to make sure that if the top 100 institutions by publications were generating a third of the articles, they were essentially sort of resulting in about a third of our publishing expenses, that same group should ultimately be generating about the same percentage of income, and so on and so forth down the table. If I fast forward to late 2023, which is when we did this analysis, we've essentially doubled the income from each of these top tiers, the top 100 and the top 250. We haven't seen a huge amount of movement on the bottom, but we're seeing things moving in the right direction. We're not where we need to be, but we are moving in the right direction. It's improved a little bit since I think we put this data together, but you see the trend that's happening. This is just a very quick snapshot of the articles that we publish in the communications of the ACM. You'll see the kind of detail that we provide around what it costs to run ACM's publishing program and what revenue we generate. So I've called out the most important numbers here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but when we talk about sustainability, and if you look back at that first slide that I presented, the mandate was to transition within 5 years sustainably. So we need to do it in a way that is sustainable. And for ACM, there's a very tangible definition of financial sustainability, and that is $27 million in today's dollars. That's approximately what it costs ACM to run all of the publications, and do typesetting and manage the digital library and pay staff, which is, I should say, very lean organization already, not a lot of fat in the system, but that's the size of the program. And we're generating about 26.5, 27 million in total. And you can see in these articles, you can look I can send out links to SIGGRAPH afterwards so you can see the full articles that have been published where you can really drill down into the numbers and understand what it costs. What's also included in this, I'll make this side note for SIGGRAPH, is what was $3.7 million in digital library allocation that gets transferred to the SIGs. So there's a DL allocation out of digital library sales and income that the SIGs benefit from every year, just under $4 million a year. And that's baked into this 27 million. So you should just keep that in mind. Okay, this is sort of one of the things that I think is really important to highlight. So the goal is by the end of 2025, we're going to flip to become a fully open access publisher. We want to be sustainable. 23 million out of that 27 million is digital library income. The other 4 million comes from a variety of sources, selling books, selling a little bit of advertising. We have a job board for anyone looking for a tenure track position in computer science. Go to jobs.acm.org. In order to be fully sustainable as an organization, we need to be able to generate $23 million in digital library income from ACM Open. And what's essentially been happening is as we've done this transition over the last 3 years, DL income goes down, ACM Open income goes up, and ultimately we need to get to 23 million. If we can't get to 23 million, then ACM is going to have some tough decisions. None of that has been decided, but one of the things that ACM's president, Giannis Ioannidis, has stated publicly in ACM council meetings and elsewhere is that ACM is so committed to this transition that in January of 2026, if we don't reach that 23 million, that ACM will tap into some of the reserve funds that ACM has. And ACM has considerable reserve funds to tap into. You can't do that forever. And so we have to be sustainable. Things have to be moving in the right direction. But if you look on the left side of this kind of this interesting multicolored design, the left side is the income that brings in, and the right side are all of the things that ACM spends money on. And so some of those things are related to conferences, about 41 million out of ACM's. It's about 80 million, I think, is the total top line income for all of ACM, out of which this 27 million in publishing comes from. 41 comes from conferences, expenses and income. Personnel, SIG governance is $6.9 million. Awards, 2.3 million. You can look down this very long tail of items. And if ACM isn't sustainable on the publishing side, ACM may have to look at some of these items and say, you know, what do we need to do to make sure that the organization is sustainable over the long term? Important to say that the model of ACM Open was developed using hard data. And I'm putting up just a bit of data just so you can get a sense of what that data looks like. I'll explain it. This table represents the number of articles that ACM publishes in each of the years between 2019 and 2023, where the corresponding author of the article is affiliated with that institution on the left-hand column. And so you can look, for example, at Tsinghua University, just as an example. Tsinghua published 376 articles in 2023, where the corresponding author was affiliated with Tsinghua University. They actually published more like 500 articles, where you look at secondary authors. But we're focused with the model just on corresponding authors, so we can assign one paper to one institution for simplicity's sake. Looking at the model, again, won't get into too much detail here, just looking at the clock and wanting to make sure we have enough time. This is the all-in model where we look at the same data, we apply that data based on the costs of producing either a conference article or a journal article, and we measure that at the institution level, and then we aggregate all of that. And then typically you'll come out with a number at the bottom of the table, and that's the number where we ask the consortium or the government to cover on behalf of all of those participating members. We have about a dozen of those kinds of deals, and I'll show you kind of what that looks like. Very quickly, what you see is a map, color-coded. The darkest are obviously the places where we're publishing the most, lightest the least, superimposed with some numbers at the country level. This is a little bit out of date. This is, I think it was last updated about a year ago. So we've actually improved these numbers quite a bit. This is the number of institutions based on last year. Again, this is a little bit out of date, where you can see in that fourth column, total number of institutions per tier. And then at that time, about a year ago, the total number of institutions in each tier that had already signed on to ACM Open. Okay, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Just this is how many articles we're actually publishing every year. We have this term called normalized versus not normalized. What that essentially means is if it's a normalized article, last year that was just over 27,000 articles, it means we're able to affiliate the corresponding author with an institution. If it's not normalized, it means that we either didn't receive the institutional data, the author didn't include that institutional data in the article itself or upon submission of the article, and we're not able to affiliate a paper with an institution. And so you can see there's about 2,000 articles that are not assigned to a given institution. So that's something every year the data is getting better, systems are getting better, the metadata is getting better. We expect by the end of next year that about 70% of the articles that we publish every year are going to be covered by ACM Open licenses. We're at about 55%. And there are a number of large national deals that we're working on that will push us from 55% over 60%. And then next year, we think that we'll get to about 70%. That means both in terms of the number of articles, percentage of articles, the number of institutions that have signed on to ACM Open as of today, that's about 1,400 institutions, and that total dollar value out of the 23 million target that we need to reach. Okay, some considerations for SIGs. Will the SIGs continue to receive that distribution? The short answer is yes. Certainly in the coming years, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're confident of that. If the model itself is not sustainable, meaning not enough institutions join, then I think ACM's leadership will look at everything on the table and decide what do they need to do to be sustainable as an organization and as an open access publisher. So that's first and foremost. But in the near term, yes, we believe that that allocation will continue to go to the SIGs. If I am a corresponding author at an institution on January 1st, 2026, and my institution has not joined, and I am not subject to a financial waiver, so I'm not in one of those countries where I'm automatically eligible to have that fee waived. What does that mean? It means that the author is going to have to pay an article processing charge. That is the backup plan. We don't want it to be that way, but the reality is that in order to be sustainable over the long term, every paper that ACM publishes has a cost and needs to be paid for from somewhere. We don't want it to come from the author. We want it to come from the institution. We want it to come from, from Zuckerberg or another very wealthy benefactor who would be willing to put enough money down to subsidize ACM's publishing program. But the reality is that it's either an institution or an author at this stage. Most of our authorship, when they pay APCs to other publishers and to ACM, are able to get that APC reimbursed from their university, either out of a research grant or some other fund. There are exceptions to that, and ACM is very committed to having a very robust and liberal waiver program. So just keep that in mind. How can I help? We hear that from the SIGs all the time. And one of the key ways, we started this after the SGB meeting last October, one of the key ways that the SIGs, that your authors, that your volunteer leaders, that your conference attendees can help this is by going to your department heads, going to your libraries and urging them to sign an ACM Open license with ACM. We will be completely transparent about the costs of that. And and we'll work with your university. We're probably already working with your university to make that a reality. But getting that pressure, quite honestly, from the ground up, because it's the authors, it's the faculty, and it's the students at those institutions. Those are the ones that are going to benefit the most and be harmed the most if they're not able to actually get their institution to join. So we need your help. Will conferences continue to pay some of these vendors and other sort of fees that come with some of the conferences? I don't know how relevant this is for SIGGRAPH. I know for SIGCHI, this was a very relevant issue. And the short answer is that there are certain fees, production fees, that are covered by the APC or by ACM Open. And then there are some other services that some of the SIGs and some of the conferences utilize that are sort of additional costs. And so this is a small subset of the SIGs and the conferences that we run. But those costs are over and above what you see. By sort of the numbers, 95% of the conferences that we run and the papers that we publish, if you pay an APC or your institution is an ACM Open, there is no additional charge. There are no page charges. If you look at other publishers like IEEE, they actually have page charges over and above APCs, over and above any institutional deals that they do. Another really important question, I don't know how relevant this is for SIGGRAPH. For some SIGs, it's very relevant where there are co-sponsored conferences. IEEE is taking a very different approach to open access than ACM. IEEE, for whatever reason, has not received the amount of pressure that ACM has to transition by a specific deadline on a timeline to full open access. And IEEE has reached out to ACM via the leadership from both organizations and made it clear that they don't want ACM posting co-sponsored articles in front of a paywall on an open access basis because it doesn't fit with the model that they have. So ACM and IEEE leadership are working very hard to try to work this out. So those co-sponsored events will be accessible. Certainly the articles published in the years where ACM is running those co-sponsored events and we're doing the publications, we intend to make those articles open access. The articles that are published in the years where IEEE is in charge, and these tend to alternate back and forth, that's going to be largely up to whatever can be negotiated between IEEE and ACM leadership over the next year or so. And then, of course, one of the questions is always, ACM is doing this. And on the one hand, it's going to be great for the community. On the other hand, there are certainly going to be authors that don't want to pay APCs or can't pay APCs. And that's going to be a challenge that we need to work through. Why can't ACM be more like organizations like Usenix or Archive or AAAI who have different models for open access publication? The short answer is these are very different organizations. If I look back at that slide that I presented, where you see the color-coded all of those expense lines, all of the good works that ACM does as an organization, it's very hard to compare the cost structure of an organization like ACM to an organization like Archive. Archive has a roughly $2 million budget compared to 80 million for ACM. The breadth of the offerings from ACM are just on a completely different scale. These organizations are very different. And so, you really have to compare apples to apples.
Scott, before you move, is it okay if I'm so sorry I'm interrupting?
Please.
But Stephen Spencer had a really good question or comment there because ACM SIGGRAPH and Eurographics are co-sponsoring a number of conferences, and Eurographics is affiliated with Wiley, as Stephen is mentioning. So he's asking what happens with them.
Yeah, so it depends. Traditionally, it depends on which organization is running the publication. So one of the main ways that we manage open access is through the rights system. So when an author gets accepted through whatever the submission system that they're using, it then transfers into the ACM rights system. And that system identifies the corresponding author as being affiliated with an institution participating in ACM Open. If we're not running the publication, we have no way of normalizing or affiliating that article with an ACM Open institution and making it open access. Likewise, if we're not running the publication, It doesn't go through our APC system. So it's going to depend if Wiley is running the conference proceedings or if IEEE is running the conference proceedings. It's going to depend on their open access program, how that works. So that's kind of the key to remember. We are trying to work out an arrangement with IEEE so that everything that gets published is open on day one. But every organization is different. We can only control ourselves. We can't control what other organizations do. I'm gonna rush through the next few slides just so we have plenty of time for questions. And this is just very quickly a slide showing the really significant commitment that ACM has to equity and inclusion. If you're in any one of over 100 countries, you're not going to have to pay an APC. We're going to give free open access. And if you're in another group of about 50 countries around the world, there are very, very deep discounts on APCs, and we're trying to do national deals with those countries for open access, deeply discounted open access. And so almost every day I get a request for a waiver. And today we got a request for an entire conference that's being run out of India. And we're working very hard to come up with sort of a solution for that conference that doesn't put that conference in jeopardy. I'm not going to go again through all these numbers, but very, very quickly, when we talk about the 27 million in publishing, we talk about the 23 million in digital library income. It's going to be a combination at the end of the day of ACM Open licenses, APC income, and if there's any remaining digital library income. Ultimately, we need to get to 23 million to be sustainable every year. And so there are a lot of people within ACM, including ACM's treasurer and the ACM Investment Committee, who are spending a lot of time thinking about what are the sort of repercussions, what are the contingency plans if we don't get to that 23 million. And so just know that work is going on behind the scenes to make sure that ACM is sustainable. Very quickly, this has been the progression that we've seen over the last couple of years. Institutions joining ACM Open. We're just about 1,400 now. We expect we'll be at about 1,600 by the end of the year. We're very close to doing a national level ACM Open license for India. So any academic at a university anywhere in India would basically not have to worry about APCs. That is a deal that we're trying to do with the Ministry of Education. And I think we're fairly optimistic that will happen for 2025. That's sort of the plan. By dollars, when we think about that 23 million, we don't think we're actually going to get to 23 million by 12/31/2025. We think that we'll get to about 70% of that via ACM Open licenses, and then we will see what the impact on APCs will be. So we're expecting that there will be a significant APC income coming from a variety of sources. One of the main sources is a non-ACM conference series called the International Conference Proceeding Series, or ICPS, where we publish 250 conferences that are not ACM SIG sponsored conferences. That's a service that we've been offering for about 20 years. Talked a little bit about the all-in model. These are countries where we have national deals effectively for the vast majority of the universities in each of these countries. So those authors do not need to worry about paying APCs. And then we are going institution by institution everywhere else in the country, everywhere else in the world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on industry. We have about 100 corporations around the world, the big ones that you can think of: Google, Microsoft, Apple, Samsung, et cetera. They've all joined, and they're committed to joining. And over the longer term, we want to make sure that those smaller corporations around the world that have traditionally subscribed to the digital library don't leave us. We need those license fees to continue in order for everything to be sustainable. Where are we today? These are the big risks that we see. China is an enormous risk. China is one of the very large countries around the world with no clear open access mandate. And so many of the large Chinese institutions around the world have not yet joined ACM Open. We're talking to many of them. Chinese Academy of Sciences and Tsinghua University were early adopters of ACM Open, and there are a handful of other institutions. But by the numbers, the vast majority in China have not joined because they're waiting for the government. They're waiting to see what the mandates are, whether there will be money available, what guidance there is from the government. Why is that an enormous risk for ACM? Because as of 2023, China represented 30% of what ACM publishes every year. It outpaced the United States, which is the second largest by publishing volume, in 2021 and continues to grow. So as more and more papers come from China, and more papers get accepted from China, what's going to happen by the time we get to 2026, unless there's a mandate, unless there's a national level deal, most Chinese authors, corresponding authors, are going to have to pay APCs to ACM when they publish with ACM. The good news, maybe the only good news there, is that China has a culture already where paying APCs is possible, and there is funding for it. And we see this through a variety of different sources. And we held a summit in Asia last fall where we had department heads and deans from some of the large universities in China and around Asia. We sat in a room for 2 days and talked about all of this. And paying APCs, we do not think is going to be an enormous bottleneck, but we wanted to test that. So we flipped the ICPS series earlier this year. ICPS is that non-ACM sponsored conference series where about 50% of the articles for that series come from China. So we're starting to test what the behaviors are for paying APCs out of China. And then we'll obviously use that information in some of our thinking before 2026. Canada, India, Japan are still challenging for us. There has not been widespread adoption of ACM Open yet in those countries. We're working very hard to see that happen. France is on this slide, but France is done. As of this morning, we signed the last institutional license, and 98% of all of the institutions that publish with ACM in France are now in ACM Open, so French authors really don't have to worry anymore. We would like that to be the case for Japan, Canada, and India by the time we get to 2026, but we need everyone's help doing that. I won't go into the rest of those, the timeline. Let me flip forward, and you'll see all these slides because I'll circulate them to some of the data that we've already shared with some of the SIGs. So this is at the SIG level, but probably more useful for everybody is SIGGRAPH level. As of earlier this year, so this isn't completely up to date. It was, I think, March of 2024. So it's a few months out of date. The percentage of articles published at each of these conferences in the years, so these were 2023 conferences, looking at those articles and their corresponding authors, where they're affiliated with, and comparing that against the current list of ACM Open institutions. So if you look at the first one on the list, 55% of, if those same articles were published today, 55% of those articles would be covered from ACM Open, which means 45% would require either an APC or a financial waiver. And then you can see that for all of the remaining conferences on this list, and you'll see it on, I have the rest of them on the next slide. Important, the numbers are a little bit better than this because we've signed probably another 100 or so institutions in the last month. And it's important to keep in mind, it doesn't include the 400 to 500 institutions that we think are highly likely to join before the end of this period in 2025. This was the remaining number. Again, you'll see all of this so you can analyze it. And then one of the last slides is, we're also thinking about contingencies, and ACM, one of the things that ACM has historically never done, it's never advertised in the digital library. And if you're a paying institution or you're an ACM member and you pay for your access to the digital library, we're not going to clutter up the digital library with advertising. But if you're not an institution that's supporting ACM or supporting this model, ACM needs to look at ways to potentially monetize that. The other thing that we're starting to look at, what we're calling the value-added services, 2 versions of the ACM Digital Library, the second bullet here, is essentially a freemium model. And we're doing some market research now. And what that means is that open access guarantees that everyone will be able to access the articles that ACM publishes. So if we were to do this, and no decisions have been made, the entire world would be able to access a version of the digital library that contains every article that we publish. Basic search, basic functionality. But if you use the digital library, you know, there's a lot of functionality in the DL. It's a very large index. Author profile pages, institutional profile pages. We're indexing thousands of non-ACM publications. And there's a robustness, advanced search. And the question is, do we give all of that away for free? If we're not able to raise $23 million simply through the ACM Open model, do we look for other ways of monetizing that? And so if you're a paying institution, you're in ACM Open, then of course you get the best available version. But if you're not paying and you leave, and as an institution, you become essentially a free rider on the system, then maybe there's an opportunity there. Those are the slides. I apologize it's taken so long. I'm willing to stay as long as others are willing to stay and answer as many questions as you have. And so I'll turn it back over to everyone else.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That was so thorough and wonderful. I want to give Jonathan anything you'd like to add, anything.
Let's go to the questions, because I think we should give people a chance to make sure they have all their questions answered. And Scott's presentation was very comprehensive.
Very comprehensive, and I think we tried to answer a lot of those as they came. But I wanted to ask, because this has come up a lot, at least within our leadership, of what would happen to our conferences, right? So who, like, are they anything that goes to the DL, like all the contributors who for various programs who submit and their content gets accepted, who would be required to pay that APC? And can we talk about that a little bit? Thanks.
So I haven't gone into too much detail on this here, but I'll send this information separately. Underlying all of this is the concept of an APC eligible article. So we talk about APCs. It was the first question that got asked. And there is a clear definition of what an APC eligible article is. And let me just actually take a second. And while I'm talking through this, I'm going to see if I can find that and then just put that very clearly up on the screen. Give me 1 second. And as I'm looking for it, let me say that ACM publishes something on the order of 30 to 35,000 articles and different kinds of content. So there are animations from SIGGRAPH, there are editorials, there are posters, there are all kinds of different content. Some of those are considered APC eligible and some of them are not. And so first and foremost, the only articles that anybody would ever be asked to pay an APC for is APC eligible articles. Generally speaking, and I'm almost there, you're looking at research articles, you're looking at, let me find it. It's not in a very large Google sheet that I have here. I'm flipping through tabs. Not so easy to find. Okay, so, but it's short articles, it's full research articles, it is survey review articles, and a handful of other article types. When ACM flips to open access, everything in the DL is unlocked, right? So it's only that subset, and it's about, as you could see in the data that I showed before, it's about 29,000 what we call APC eligible articles. So there's a lot, and SIGGRAPH is let's say, more of the exception compared to many of the other SIGs, where there's an enormous breadth of content types, demos, and other kinds of things that we would never ask. Oh, finally, I found it. Okay. Great. Would never even consider asking. Okay, so hang on 1 sec. Can you see that?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, so APC eligible interviews, notes, research articles, review articles, short papers, survey articles, technical notes, and tutorials. Everything on the right side that you see where it says no, All of that content is going to be freely available if it's not already, but they would never be asked to pay an APC for those articles. So I hope that answers.
That's very helpful because there's a lot of misconceptions there, right? Because we have so many programs, so many different contexts. So that's really great. And I'm so glad to see that list, because I remember I saw it at the SGB meeting, but now it's a little bit even more longer. And
the basic rule of thumb, this is also on a website.
Yeah.
I'll send you a link. It's on acm.org, publications/open access. The basic idea, sort of how we came to that list, was the articles that are considered APC eligible are the article types where the big funders around the world typically would allow a piece of the research grant to be covering an APC. And so we wanted to make sure that if we're going to ever even ask somebody for an APC, which is always the last resort, that it's an APC that they have the greatest likelihood of being reimbursed by their institution for. So, all of the other content types that come out of SIGGRAPH, you don't have to worry about. It's just, the cost of hosting that content in the digital library and any work that's done on it. I mean, to be quite honest, those costs are baked into that $27 million worth of expenses that we have. So it's baked into the model, but we're never going to ask an author to pay for it.
Got it. Great. Thank you. There was a question that came from Susan, and she was asking, how do the institutional charges compare with those of other disciplines?
So nobody, important to say this, nobody has a model like ACM's. Most other publishers, and by most, I'll say, just to use a few examples, Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, and IEEE, which are probably the other major publishers in computing. All of their read and publish models, and they all have read and publish models. So they have institutional models where they sign a license with an institution that pays the money. Those models are APC based, which means the publisher negotiates a price with the institution. Typically, there's a cap on the number of articles that can get published under that license. And then the author still has to pay a discounted APC. So they're still getting the authors to pay some money. And then, so they're splitting kind of the cost between the institution and the author. When we did sort of our work at the very beginning, and we worked with these large institutions, it became very clear, and we talked to a lot of computer scientists, they don't want computer scientists paying APCs. If I look at other disciplines like biomedicine, medicine, other hard sciences, chemistry, biology, et cetera, the APC costs are significantly higher. The average APC for any of those other publishers that I mentioned is between $2,800 and $3,000 or more. If you're a medical researcher and you get accepted in Nature, which is the holy grail of those disciplines, the APC is something like $12,000 to $14,000. Just to give you some frame of reference. The conference APC for ACM is $1,000 if none of the authors are an ACM member, and if one of the authors is an ACM member, it's $700. That's the full price APC. If you're in any of the countries that would help you qualify for a 50% discount, then it's half of that price, half of the discounted price. And then, of course, there's lots of countries where it's completely waived entirely. Nevertheless, you're going to have a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon who says, I don't have access to $700 or $1,000. And that's going to be a challenge. I mean, we have to figure out how to do that. I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do to make it easier is in the e-commerce system that we've built. If you've got 3 authors, you can split the $700 3 ways, however you want. You can have a third party paying for it on your behalf. And so in China, we're offering WePay and Alipay, and there will be an invoicing option. So we're trying to be as flexible, and we'll add flexibility over time. But generally speaking, this is how we compare to others. Our model is very unique. there are a lot of people that like our model because it's unlimited. So
Mhm.
universities can predict for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, because we have some universities that have signed on for 5 years. They know exactly what they're going to pay each and every year during that contract. It's fixed, and there are no additional charges for the author, no charges for anyone. And so the last thing to say, which touches a little bit on the question, is nobody in SIGGRAPH, I don't want to say you don't need to worry about this, because it is coming. We're fast approaching 2026, but none of SIGGRAPH will be impacted. Everything is still optional through the end of 2025. So none of the conferences that take place this year and next year are being forced, if you will, to have a mandatory APC or mandatory ACM Open or mandatory a waiver. So for ACM conferences and ACM journals, it only becomes mandatory on January 1st, 2026.
Yeah, which is not that far off. But we have another question from Ray, who said, I fully support the OEA and currently publish my CS and CG books and papers with Springer Open. I pay a fee for books, but for papers, because is covered by UK institutional agreements, it appears IEEE CGNA and TVCG will be left behind if they don't go OA. What can we do? If IEEE CS and CG authors want OA, should they send their papers to ACM? How best to solve this competition problem?
It's
Great
probably
question.
fair of me to say this. Maybe Jonathan, you want to answer the question, but my attitude is yes, you should send them to ACM. Since
I mean, that's what I would do. I work in I do have one SIGGRAPH paper due to a collaboration, but I work mostly in programming languages and software engineering, and many of the software engineering conferences are co-sponsored by IEEE. And I wish they were committing to this the way ACM is. But I'm proud of what ACM is doing, and I think if they get some competition from if IEEE sees more competition from ACM, hopefully they'll be more motivated to take open access seriously.
it's also worth noting that first of all, there's a website that I can send you, Mona, the link to if you want to distribute it throughout SIGGRAPH, that shows the list of 1,400 institutions. So if I'm an author in the UK and I'm wondering, am I covered? Do I have to worry about an APC at the time of submission? The answer is no, because about 107 out of 110 institutions in the UK have signed on to ACM Open. We're basically done. There are a handful of smaller institutions that haven't yet, but the vast majority have. So certain countries have gone faster than others. The UK, it's not a surprise with the UK, because the UK was one of the first to come out with open access mandates. They really mean it. They've been willing to kind of get behind it and funding and all of those things. So we've seen penetration grow very, very quickly over the last year and a half. But you can get a sense from that website which institutions are already covered. And if you're in one of those institutions, you don't have to think about it anymore. There's nothing you need to do. Once you get accepted into the conference, you're going to get sent automatically through a workflow. You get to select your Creative Commons license. It gets published. You retain your copyright. It's OA. You don't have to pay anything. So we expect that's going to be the case for about 70% of those 2,600 institutions by the end of next year. And we're working on this India deal. We're working on a number of other deals in Brazil. It's an all or nothing proposition. They haven't gone for it yet, but and there are a few other countries where they buy centrally, and some that are talking about buying centrally. So, in one signature, we could add 200 institutions. And like Brazil, for example, is 150 institutions. India is about 150 institutions that have historically subscribed. So those numbers, if we get these arrangements, and that's why we need the pressure from the ground up. We need people going to their department heads. We need department heads talking to librarians, because librarians will say, I don't have the money. We're a tier 5 institution. I don't have $25,000. We were paying 10 to ACM. Where are we going to get the other 15? And so, there's got to be discussions inside the universities figuring out how they share costs between departments. We've been playing matchmaker at certain universities. I mean, it's funny because the libraries don't talk to the departments anymore in many places. And I've had department heads say to me, could you please make an introduction to my own librarian? That happens, as crazy as it sounds. So we really do need the community to play an active role here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for both of you for really coming here and talking with us. And for all your efforts in educating and keeping us informed. I'd love to invite you to come back here soon, like maybe in a few months, maybe in the fall or winter, because we have 2 more conferences, our big SIGGRAPH and SIGGRAPH Asia conferences, especially that we'd like to be able to keep our members and contributors really aware of what's coming. So thank you for that. We have one question that just came from Mary, so I'm going to read that as well, but thank you. What about copyright for pre-OA publication? This is not the right venue to address this, but as historian folks care about this a lot for access to early material.
So let me understand the question. It's asking about copyright. What was the specific question?
The pre-OA publications. I actually think everything's going to go OA, right? There's not going to be any pre-OA. Yes, go ahead. I think that's what. Yeah, please. Either one of you.
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I'm gonna make an assumption. Are we talking about preprints or?
So I think the question is about whether work from before open access before 2026 will be open, and the answer is it will all be open, which is delightful.
So strangely enough, if I took a poll, if I could see everybody on the Zoom, and I could take a poll and ask how many people know that ACM opened the entire archive of articles from its inception, from ACM's inception to the year 2000. So the first 50 years of what ACM published has been open access for the last 3.5 years. Or no, excuse me, the last two years or so. So the answer is yes. ACM, when we do that flip, everything, the entire archive going back to Volume 1, Issue 1 is open. If I look at Volume 1, Issue 1 up to 2000, it's already open. And most people don't know it because they're accessing the digital library via their institution, and the articles are already open. We would call those articles free because there is a specific definition around open access that requires copyright ownership by the authors and requires a variety of things, Creative Commons licenses and other things. And we couldn't go back to all of those articles. And in many instances, the authors are no longer with us. In some instances, it would just be to go back to hundreds of thousands of authors, not pragmatic. So we will unlock everything that isn't already unlocked. This was done for ACM's 75th anniversary, we opened the first 50 years. People asked, why didn't you open the first 75 years for the 75th anniversary? And the short answer was we would be out of business. ACM wouldn't be sustainable because we would lose the 27 million in income that we get that sustains the publishing program every year. So we picked kind of a line and said, okay, there's a 20-year period where there's enough value in that most recent 20 years to keep that behind the paywall until we're sustainable. And then once we're sustainable, we'll unlock the rest. And so the end of next year, we will unlock the rest.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I had questions about the recording. Yes, we recorded this, and we make sure that we distribute this to especially the leadership and community. So thank you very much. We kept you for 15 more minutes. Thank you, and we'll be in touch. Good luck with the rest of this endeavor, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, everyone. Bye.